The chandeliers of Ashford Estate blazed like captured stars, their light dancing across marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. 200 of Boston's finest moved through the ballroom in a choreographed display of wealth and breeding,
On
their silk
liberty,
gowns
a profound
rustling like
work.
whispered
Indeed, its
secrets,
ideas are
their
quite
jewels catching
revolutionary.
the
Then
light
it is yours.
with every
Thank you.
calculated gesture.
A delightful evening, is
Serafina
it not?
Grace Whitmore
Indeed, the
stood at
music
the
is
edge of it all,
enchanting,
half
and the
hidden
company
behind a
quite
towering
stimulating. And to
arrangement
new
of white lilies,
acquaintances.
and wondered not for the first time that evening why she had allowed herself to be persuaded to attend. The answer, of course, swept across the ballroom, in peacock blue silk and sapphires. Vivian Sterling Whitmore, her stepmother, who collected social triumphs the way other women collected china figurines. Serafina's presence at the pinnacle event of the Boston season was not kindness, it was strategy. A shadow to make Vivian's preserved beauty shine all the brighter. At 22, Serafina knew precisely what society thought of her. The whispers followed her like an unwelcome shadow, always just loud enough to hear, never quite loud enough to confront directly. Poor plain Serafina, such an unfortunate girl. At least she has good manners. She had learned over years of such assessments to make herself small, unobtrusive. If she could not be beautiful by their standards, perhaps she could be invisible. And invisibility, she had discovered, could be kinder than scrutiny. Her gown of faded lavender muslin whispered against her legs as she shifted position. It was outdated by at least 2 seasons, simple in cut, where other women wore elaborate crinolines that required doorways to be navigated sideways. Around her, silk rustled like distant waves punctuated by laughter that seemed always to be at someone's expense. Her light brown hair was arranged in modest braids that required no lady's maid's expertise, adorned only by her mother's single strand of pearls. The necklace was the sole piece of jewelry she owned that hadn't been sold to pay her father's gambling debts. She touched it now, drawing comfort from the smooth warmth of the pearls against her throat. Serafina's gray-blue eyes moved across the glittering assembly with the careful observation of someone who had spent a lifetime watching rather than participating. She cataloged the room's geography with practiced efficiency. The receiving line where Mrs. Ashford held court, the dance floor where couples waltzed in complicated patterns, the refreshment tables laden with champagne and delicacies most attendees would barely touch. And there near the grand staircase stood the gravitational center of every female gaze in the room. Dominic Ashford Thorne, 35 years old and possessed of the kind of bearing that seemed bred into bone and sinew. Tall and dark-haired, he wore his black tailcoat and white cravat with the casual perfection of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy space in the world. His gray eyes, a shade darker than Serafina's own, surveyed the ballroom with the assessing coolness of someone appraising horses at auction. He stood among a cluster of gentlemen, but there was no question who commanded the group. Henry Blackwood, shorter and more jovial with sandy hair and a quick smile, leaned close to say something that made Thorne's mouth quirk in what might have been amusement. Around them, other men orbited like lesser planets around the sun. Serafina had been watching him peripherally carefully for the better part of an hour. Not with any foolish romantic hope, she had learned long ago not to entertain such fantasies. Rather, she watched him the way she watched everything, with the quiet attention of someone who existed on the margins and had learned to find interest in observation itself. She was so absorbed in her study that she failed to notice Vivian's approach, until her stepmother's voice cut through the general murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. Poor Serafina. Vivian's voice carried across the immediate area with the perfect projection of someone who wished to be overheard. She stood now with Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Ashford, her expression arranged in practiced sympathy that fooled no one who truly looked. So plain, so forgettable. One must admire her courage in attending, knowing she'll spend the evening pressed against the wallpaper like part of the decoration. The words landed with the precision of an assassin's knife. Nearby guests, Lady Thornbury in peacock blue, Miss Ashford with her elaborate coiffure, several others whose names Serafina had long since stopped trying to remember, tittered behind painted fans. The sound was delicate, feminine, and utterly cruel. Serafina's fingers tightened on her own fan until the ivory sticks threatened to crack. Her face, she knew, remained composed. Years of practice had taught her to school her features into pleasant neutrality, to absorb insults the way stone absorbs rain. Silently, giving nothing back. But inside something cracked. Just slightly. Not broke, she had endured too much to break over mere words. But cracked like china developing a hairline fracture that would spread eventually into something irreparable. She became aware of other eyes turning toward her. The assessment was swift and unanimous. Yes, poor plain Serafina, exactly as Lady Vivian described. The consensus was almost visible in the slight nods, the knowing glances exchanged between matrons and debutantes alike. "I say Thorn." Henry Blackwood's voice rose above the whispers loud enough that Serafina heard every word despite the 20 feet separating them. "Show the poor girl some kindness. One dance wouldn't kill you. It might even be considered charitable." Serafina's breath caught. She hadn't realized Thorne's attention or his friends had turned in her direction at all. For one terrible, hopeful moment, she made the mistake of looking directly at Dominic Thorne. His gray eyes met hers across the expanse of gleaming floor. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for her to see the assessment in his gaze, the brief consideration, and then the dismissal. He looked away as one might look away from something mildly distasteful. When he spoke, his voice carried the bored drawl of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had never questioned whether his opinions mattered. "I partner with women who enhance my standing Blackwood, not those designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. I have no interest in charity cases, particularly those who seem purpose-built to be overlooked." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, conversation didn't stop. That would have been too obvious. But it shifted the way a flock of birds shifts direction as one organism. People pretended not to have heard while ensuring they missed not a single syllable. Serafina could feel their satisfaction, their vindication. Here was confirmation of what they all believed. She was beneath notice, unworthy even of pity. Vivian's smile was triumphant. For a long moment, Serafina simply stood there, her untouched glass of champagne growing warm in her gloved hand. She could feel the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. They expected tears, expected her to flee in humiliation, expected some dramatic display of feminine distress that would provide entertainment for the remainder of the evening and gossip for the week to follow. She would not give them that satisfaction. With movements as deliberate as a dancer's, Serafina set down her champagne glass on a nearby table. The crystal made a soft sound against the mahogany. Final. Decisive. She met Vivian's gaze directly, saw the challenge there, the triumph, the casual cruelty that had characterized their relationship since her father's remarriage 8 years ago. Then without a word, she turned and walked toward the ballroom's exit. She did not hurry, did not gather her skirts and run. She simply moved through the crowd with measured grace, her spine straight, her face composed. The sea of silk and jewels parted slightly to let her pass, whispers following in her wake like foam trailing a ship. "Did you hear what Thorne said? Designed to fade into the wallpaper? How cutting, poor thing. Though he's not wrong, is he? Where is she going? Probably to compose herself." How embarrassing. Serafina heard none of it. Or rather, she heard all of it and let it wash over her without penetration, the way one might let rain fall without truly feeling wet. She had learned this skill over years of being the object of such commentary. The terrace doors stood open to admit the cool May evening. She stepped through them into darkness, punctuated by starlight, into air that smelled of coal smoke and distant gardens rather than perfume and candle wax. Out here, the sounds of the ballroom became muffled. Violin music and laughter reduced to a pleasant murmur, like the ocean heard from a great distance. Serafina moved to the stone balustrade and gripped it with both hands, grateful for the cool solidity of marble beneath her fingers. The night sky stretched above her, vast and indifferent. Stars glittered with cold beauty, utterly unconcerned with the dramas unfolding in ballrooms below. Boston sprawled in all directions, a constellation of gaslight and shadow. For the first time that evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Serafina allowed her composure to crack. A single tear slid down her cheek, warm against her cool skin. She brushed it away quickly, almost angrily. "I will not break," she whispered to the indifferent stars. "I will not give them that satisfaction." The words were a vow, a promise to herself that whatever happened next, she would endure it with the same quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of being invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Behind her, the ball continued. Dominic Thorne doubtless danced with ladies who enhanced his standing. Vivian accepted compliments on her gown, her beauty, her social acumen. The world turned on its axis, utterly unchanged by one unremarkable woman's humiliation. Serafina stood alone on the terrace until the cold drove her inside. Then she slipped through the quarters of Ashford Estate to find a footman to summon her carriage. She did not return to the ballroom. The breakfast room of Whitmore House received morning light through tall windows that overlooked a modest garden. Serafina sat at the mahogany table, a cup of tea cooling before her untouched. She had not slept. The events of the previous evening played in her mind with the relentless repetition of a music box wound too tight, designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. The words shouldn't have hurt as much as they did. She had heard worse or at least equally cruel assessments many times before. But something about Thorne's casual dismissal, the ease with which he had reduced her to nothing more than unfortunate upholstery, had lodged in her chest like a splinter. The door opened with the particular decisive energy that announced Vivian before she even appeared. "Ah, Serafina, good. We need to speak." Her stepmother swept into the room in a morning dress of deep rose, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She settled into the chair across from Serafina with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver news they particularly enjoyed. Serafina set down her teacup carefully. "Good morning, Lady Vivian." "I've made arrangements," Vivian announced without preamble. "You're to go to Rosemont Manor in Rhode Island, indefinitely. The sea air will do you good, and frankly, your presence here has become embarrassing to the family name." The words took a moment to penetrate. Rosemont Manor. But that estate has been abandoned for years. "It will suit you perfectly, then." Vivian's smile was sharp as cut glass. Solitude for the solitary. "I've already sent word to have it aired out and made habitable. You leave in 3 days." Serafina stared at her stepmother, searching for some sign of hesitation, some indication that this was merely another of Vivian's casual cruelties rather than a genuine plan. She found none. "You're banishing me." The words emerged flatly, a statement rather than a question. "Don't be melodramatic. I'm providing you with a comfortable retreat where you won't be subjected to the rigors of society that so clearly distress you." Vivian poured herself tea with movements of studied elegance. "After last night's incident, it's clear that Boston is not the proper environment for you. In Rhode Island, you can occupy yourself with whatever simple pleasures suit you. Reading, perhaps, long walks, the contemplation of nature." The subtext was clear. In Rhode Island, you will be invisible. "You will not embarrass me with your presence. You will cease to exist in any way that matters. And if I refuse—" Vivian's eyes hardened. "This house belongs to the Whitmore estate, which I manage as your father's widow. You have a small independence from your mother, barely enough to maintain yourself in modest circumstances. You may choose to use it to establish yourself in some dingy set of rooms in an unfashionable quarter, subject to gossip and speculation about what scandal drove you from your family home. Or you may accept my generous offer of Rosemont Manor, where you may live in comfortable privacy." It was Serafina recognized a trap with no exit. Vivian had planned this carefully, had perhaps been planning it for some time. Last night's humiliation had simply provided the perfect excuse. 3 days, Serafina repeated softly. 3 days, Vivian confirmed. "I'll have Stevens arrange the travel. Really, Serafina, you should be grateful. Not everyone would be so considerate." She rose and glided from the room, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the wreckage of Serafina's life. For a long moment, Serafina sat in the silence her stepmother had left behind. Through the window, she could see the garden roses beginning to bloom, completely indifferent to human dramas. Birds sang, the world continued. Slowly, something shifted inside her chest. Not the crack deepening, but something else. Something like clarity. If Boston didn't want her, perhaps Rhode Island would teach her who she was without their judgment. Perhaps being forgotten by this world might be the beginning of finding herself in another. Dominic Thorne sat in a leather chair near the fire, a glass of excellent brandy in his hand, and listened to conversations swirl around him without particular interest. "Whitmore's packed off his plain daughter to Rhode Island," someone remarked. Lord Peterson. Dominic thought, though he didn't bother to look. "Can't say I blame him. Girl's a millstone around the family's neck." Dominic felt something flicker in his chest, discomfort perhaps, or guilt. He had not thought of the Whitmore girl since the previous evening. Or rather, he had thought of her only briefly in the moment before sleep, when her face had surfaced in his mind unbidden. That quiet, composed expression as she walked from the ballroom. Not crying, not making a scene, simply leaving. Designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. His own words. Clever. Cutting. Exactly the sort of wit that his circle appreciated. Henry had laughed. Others had smiled knowingly. It had been a successful rejoinder, the kind that cemented his reputation for sharp observation and sharper tongue. But now, sitting in the comfort of his club with brandy warming his throat, Dominic found the memory less satisfying than it should have been. She was being sent away because of him. Or not because of him specifically, but because of the society he represented and reinforced. Because she did not meet standards of beauty that he had never questioned, because he had never needed to question them. He took another sip of brandy, willing the thought away. She would be happier in the country, surely. Away from the pressures of society. The constant assessments, the merciless social calculus that governed Boston's ballrooms. Perhaps it was a kindness in its way. Perhaps she would find peace in Rhode Island in whatever simple occupations would fill her days. Perhaps he had done her a favor. The rationalization felt thin even as he constructed it. But Dominic Ashford Thorne had spent 35 years learning to believe comfortable lies about himself and his world. This was simply one more. Another brandy, Mr. Thorne, the server inquired. Yes, Dominic said, and see if Blackwood is available. I wish to discuss the railroad expansion. Railroads, politics, the management of his estates. These were proper concerns for a man of his position. The fate of one unremarkable girl who couldn't manage the demands of society was none of his affair. That night alone in his chambers at Thorne House, he saw her face again, gray blue eyes meeting his across a ballroom floor. The brief moment of contact before he dismissed her. Not plain exactly, he admitted to himself in the darkness, but unremarkable, forgettable. He told himself this until he believed it, and then he slept. Serafina stood in her bedroom at Whitmore House packing by candlelight, though the hour was not late. Somehow the intimacy of darkness seemed appropriate for this task, the sorting of a life into what could be carried and what must be left behind. She had few enough possessions that the work went quickly. Clothing mostly, simple and out of fashion. A few books, including her mother's copy of Wuthering Heights, its spine cracked from repeated readings. The pearl necklace carefully wrapped in soft cloth. A miniature portrait of her mother painted before illness had stolen the color from her cheeks. Outside her window, Boston continued its glittering existence. Somewhere ballrooms were lit and music played. Somewhere Vivian was accepting compliments, secure in her social triumph. Somewhere Dominic Thorne was doing whatever men of his station did when they were not casually destroying people with their words. Serafina paused with the copy of Wuthering Heights in her hands, remembering Catherine Earnshaw's passionate declaration. I am Heathcliff. What would it be like, she wondered, to love and be loved with such certainty, to matter so completely to another person that your very souls were intertwined? She would never know. That kind of passion, that kind of recognition, was not for girls designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. But perhaps, and this thought came to her with the quiet force of revelation, perhaps there were other ways to matter, other forms of significance beyond being noticed at balls desired by powerful men, celebrated by society. Perhaps in Rhode Island, far from the scrutiny that had measured her and found her wanting, she might discover what those other ways were. She tucked the novel carefully into her trunk and closed the lid. Rhode Island, then, she whispered to the empty room, to the indifferent city beyond her window, to whatever future awaited her in exile. Let us see what I might become. The candle flickered but did not go out. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed midnight, and Serafina Grace Whitmore, who had been dismissed as plain and forgettable, allowed herself to imagine just for a moment that being forgotten by this world might be the beginning of finding herself in another. The journey to Rhode Island took 3 days, and with each mile Boston's soot-stained elegance gave way to something wilder, more honest. Serafina watched through the coach window as manicured parks became rolling countryside, as cultivated gardens surrendered to untamed hedgerows thick with hawthorn and bramble. The air changed, coal smoke gradually replaced by the scent of grass and earth, and finally, as they approached the coast, the sharp tang of salt. By the 3rd day, the landscape had transformed entirely. The road narrowed to little more than a track carved between stone walls, winding through terrain that seemed to belong to another world. Here the wind bent trees into permanent submission, and the sky stretched vast and changeable clouds racing across it like thoughts across an unsettled mind. When the coach finally crested the last hill and Rosemont Manor came into view, Serafina's first thought was that Manor was generous. The structure was a large stone house, 2 stories of weathered gray granite, that looked as though it had grown from the clifftop rather than been built upon it. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the sea. The garden, if it could be called that, had long since surrendered to nature's designs. Wild roses and brambles created a thorny maze that pressed against the walls, and beyond it all the sea. Serafina heard it before she fully saw it, a constant roar almost violent in its intensity. Waves crashed against the cliffs below, with a force that seemed determined to pull the land itself into the depths. The sound was nothing like the gentle water features of Boston's parks. This was raw, elemental, utterly indifferent to human presence. The coach door opened, and a weathered woman in her 60s stood waiting. She wore simple gray wool and a white cap, her face lined by years of coastal wind, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You'll be Lady Serafina, then?" It was not quite a question. I'm Mrs. Catherine Wells. I've aired out the east bedroom and laid a fire. Supper's simple, we've no staff for fancy Boston cooking. Serafina stepped down from the coach, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel. Thank you, Mrs. Wells. I'm grateful for your preparation. The older woman's eyes softened slightly. You look half frozen, miss. Come inside before this wind cuts through you. The interior of Rosemont was clean but spare. Mrs. Wells had clearly done her best, but no amount of dusting could disguise the manor's fundamental emptiness. Minimal furniture, faded curtains that had once been blue, floors of dark wood that echoed with each footstep. The fire in the drawing room hearth provided warmth, but made the shadows in the corners seem deeper by contrast. I'll bring your supper to the dining room in an hour, Mrs. Wells said. The east bedroom is up the stairs, first door on the left. I'll have your trunk brought up directly. Then she was gone, her footsteps receding toward what Serafina assumed must be the kitchen, leaving her alone in this strange, stark house that was now apparently her home. The first weeks passed in a haze of profound isolation. Serafina wandered the rooms of Rosemont like a ghost learning its geography through repetition. The drawing room with its faded chairs. The dining room where she took solitary meals, Mrs. Wells' simple cooking served on china that had seen better days. The small morning room overlooking the wild garden. The library, though it hardly deserved the name, containing perhaps 40 books, their leather bindings cracked with age. She wrote letters because it gave her something to do, some connection to the world she'd left behind. To her father, dear Papa, I have arrived safely in Rhode Island. Rosemont is remote but adequate. I hope you are well. I remain your devoted daughter, Serafina. No response came. To Charlotte Ashford, who had been something approximating a friend at finishing school, dear Charlotte, you may have heard I've removed to Rhode Island for my health. The sea air is quite bracing. I hope Boston continues to agree with you. Yours, Serafina. Charlotte's reply arrived 3 weeks later, a single page of polite nothings that made clear she considered their acquaintance concluded. How adventurous you are, dear Serafina, to embrace such rustic solitude. I'm sure it suits you. Boston remains delightful as always. I must close as Mrs. Thornberry's ball begins in 2 hours. With warm regards, C. Ashford. The subtext was unmistakable. I am dancing in ballrooms while you rot in exile. We have nothing more to say to one another. After that, Serafina wrote only in her journal, pages filled with observations that no one would ever read. Descriptions of the sea's changing moods, catalogues of her own loneliness, questions without answers about what she was meant to do with the remainder of her life. 3 weeks into her exile, a massive storm struck the coast. Serafina stood at her bedroom window, watching nature's violence unfold with a kind of terrible fascination. The wind shrieked around the manor's corners, rattling window panes in their frames. Rain fell in sheets so thick the garden disappeared into gray nothing, and the sea transformed into something monstrous. Waves towering higher than houses before crashing against the cliffs with force that shook the ground. It was beautiful, terrifying and beautiful. As she watched, something inside Serafina cracked. Not broke, she had thought herself broken already, but cracked like ice giving way to spring thaw. I am alone, she thought. The realization hit with the force of those waves, truly completely alone. No one is coming to rescue me. No one is thinking of me. I am forgotten. The words should have been devastating. Instead, they brought a strange clarity, and then quieter but more powerful than I am free. Free from the weight of expectations she could never meet. Free from the constant assessment of eyes that found her wanting. Free from the exhausting work of making herself small, acceptable and visible. Here in this isolated manor on the edge of the world, no one was watching. No one cared whether she was plain or beautiful, proper or improper, worthy of us or worthless. She could be anything. Or nothing. The choice was entirely hers. The realization settled over her like a benediction. The next morning, restless and seeking distraction, Serafina explored parts of Rosemont she had previously ignored. In a corner room on the second floor behind a door she'd assumed led to a closet, she discovered a small study. Dust motes danced in the light from a single window. A desk sat beneath it, and 3 walls were lined with bookshelves. Unlike the meager collection in the main library, these shelves were full. Perhaps 200 volumes, their spines bearing titles that made Serafina's breath catch. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Essays by Harriet Martineau. Political treatises that would have scandalized any Boston drawing room. Some previous inhabitant of Rosemont had been a radical thinker, and they had left their intellectual treasures behind. Serafina pulled down the Wollstonecraft and opened to a random page. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. She read the sentence standing up, too absorbed to sit. Then she carried the book downstairs and read through supper, barely tasting Mrs. Wells's fish stew. She read by firelight until the words blurred. And when she finally slept, her dreams were full of ideas rather than ballrooms. "You're looking less like a ghost, miss, and more like a person with purpose," Mrs. Wells observed a week later, setting down Seraphina's breakfast with a nod of approval. Seraphina, who had brought 3 books to the table, looked up in surprise. "Am I? That you are. Got some color in your cheeks, too. The walking helps, I expect." The walking had become a daily necessity. Seraphina had begun venturing beyond Rosemont's grounds, following the cliff paths toward the village of Narragansett Point, 2 miles distant. The exercise cleared her mind, and the village, small and unpretentious, offered a glimpse of life utterly different from anything she'd known in Boston. It was on one of these walks, a month into her exile, that she met Violet Harper. The girl was perhaps 9 years old, barefoot, despite the cool morning, with dark hair escaping from a simple braid, and eyes that held intelligence far beyond her years. She stood at the edge of the cliff, staring at the sea with an expression of fierce concentration. "Hello," Seraphina said, not wanting to startle her. The girl turned, eyes widening. "You're the lady from Rosemont, the one from Boston." "I am. My name is Seraphina. What's yours?" "Violet Harper. My da's a fisherman." She said this with pride. "Are you really from a city? What's it like?" They talked for an hour, about fishing and cities, about the sea and books. Violet had never learned to read. Her father couldn't afford schooling, and her mother had died when she was small. "I wish I could read," Violet said wistfully. "Letters seem like secret codes. If you know the code, you can understand anything." Something stirred in Seraphina's chest, a purpose she hadn't known she was seeking. "Would you like me to teach you?" Violet's face transformed. "Truly, you'd do that, if your father permits it." They met the next day on the beach. Seraphina taught Violet the alphabet by drawing letters in the sand with a stick, each one accompanied by a story. A for adventure, B for brave, C for clever. When Violet managed to spell her own name, her gap-toothed grin was worth more than all the compliments Seraphina had never received in Boston ballrooms. Word spread in the small village. Within 2 weeks, Reverend Porter's wife, a kind woman named Alice, with capable hands and warm eyes, sought out Seraphina at Rosemont. "Miss Whitmore, several village girls are eager to learn their letters. Our resources are limited." She gestured apologetically. "Would you perhaps consider helping? Even an hour a week would be transformative for them." Seraphina's first instinct was refusal. She had never taught anyone anything. What could she possibly offer? But then she thought of Violet's face when she'd written her name, of the hunger for knowledge she'd seen in the girl's eyes, of the books in Rosemont's hidden library, and the hunger for knowledge that had awakened in herself. "I've never taught before," she said slowly. "Nor had I when I began," Mrs. Porter replied. "But I found that a willing student and a patient teacher can accomplish remarkable things together." "Then yes, I'll try." The following Sunday, 6 girls between the ages of 8 and 14 gathered in the church vestry, their work-roughened hands folded in their laps, regarding Seraphina with a mixture of shyness and reverence. "A real lady," one whispered to another. "Teaching us." Seraphina, who had never felt particularly real or particularly ladylike, smiled uncertainly. "My name is Miss Seraphina," she said, "and I understand you'd like to learn to read." Eager nods all around. She had no formal training, no pedagogy beyond her own education, but she had books and patience and a sudden fierce desire to give these girls something Boston had never given her, the sense that they mattered. She began with the alphabet but made it a game. Each letter had a story. She taught them to write their names, watching their faces light up as they saw their own identities take shape on slate. When young Violet, with her gap-toothed grin, struggled with her letters, Seraphina didn't scold. Instead, she said gently, "Learning is like solving a secret code. Once you know it, the whole world opens up." Violet's eyes widened. "Like magic." "Exactly like magic," Seraphina confirmed. And watching the girl's face transform with understanding, Seraphina laughed genuinely freely for the first time since the Ashford Ball. The Sunday lessons expanded to twice weekly. Mrs. Porter mentioned that women in neighboring villages had heard of the lady teaching letters. More students appeared. Seraphina's small allowance from her mother's trust, barely sufficient for her own needs, stretched impossibly thin as she purchased books and supplies. She began selling her Boston gowns, those elaborate confections that had never suited her anyway. A dressmaker in the market town gave her decent prices, clearly puzzled why a lady would part with such finery. Seraphina used the money to buy primers, slates, chalk paper, Every penny became an investment in minds hungry for knowledge. She wrote to her father one last time, "Dear Papa, I am engaged in educational charity work that requires modest additional funding. Might I access a small portion of Mother's trust for this purpose?" No response came. But 3 months into her teaching, something unexpected arrived. A letter from a Boston law firm containing a bank draft for $200. No explanation, no name, only a brief note for the educational endeavors in Rhode Island, a donation from a concerned benefactor. Serafina stared at the draft for a long time trying to understand. Who would send money? Who even knew about her work? The money came again 3 months later, and 3 months after that. Always the same amount, always anonymous, always with a Boston postmark. She used it to buy a small barn from a farmer whose daughter attended her classes. Together with help from the village men, fathers who considered their labor a form of tuition payment, they converted it into a proper schoolhouse. By the time Serafina had been in Rhode Island for 18 months, what had begun as Sunday lessons in a church vestry had grown into something far more substantial. 20 students, now ranging from 8 to 45 years old, gathering in the barn they'd christened Rosemont Academy. Desks purchased with mysterious donations. Shelves lined with books on every subject Serafina could acquire. Maps hung beside the chalkboard, where she taught not just reading and writing, but arithmetic, basic science, household economy, even art appreciation. One evening in late spring, nearly 2 years after her exile, young Violet, now 11, and serving as assistant teacher, read an entire page of scripture aloud in church. The congregation, fishermen and their families, people who worked with their hands and knew the value of perseverance, burst into spontaneous applause. Violet's father, a gruff man whose hands were scarred from nets and hooks, had tears streaming down his weathered face. And Serafina felt something she had never experienced in Boston's grandest ballrooms: genuine worth. One evening, as autumn approached her 3rd year in Rhode Island, Serafina stood before Rosemont's single full-length mirror. The same light brown hair, the same gray-blue eyes, the same unremarkable features that Boston society had called plain forgettable, designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. But as she studied her reflection, she realized something had changed. Not in her face, but in the way she inhabited it. "They said I was forgettable," she whispered to her reflection. "Perhaps I was, because I believed them, because I made myself small. But what if I stopped trying to be what they wanted and became something entirely my own?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but powerful. She thought of her students' eager faces, of Mrs. Porter's gratitude, of the way learning transformed people from the inside out. She thought of the books in Rosemont's hidden library and the ideas they contained, radical, dangerous, true. She thought of Boston, where she had spent 22 years trying to be acceptable and failing. And she thought of Rhode Island, where in 3 years she had built something real. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. She would stay. Not as an exile enduring banishment, but as a woman claiming her life. She would build her school, teach her students, transform not her face but her existence into something that mattered. As spring gave way to summer of her 4th year, and summer to autumn and autumn to winter again, Serafina Grace Whitmore became less the girl Boston forgot and more the woman Rhode Island needed. She began to paint. At first as therapy, long afternoons with nothing but her thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, so she purchased watercolors and paper from the village shop and attempted to capture Rhode Island's dramatic landscapes. She had no training, only observation, and a desperate need to create something beautiful from her isolation. To her surprise, she had talent. Her early work was tentative seascapes and cliff views, flowers from the garden, the play of light on water. But gradually her subjects shifted. She began painting people. The fishwife who sold oysters in the village square, her face weathered by wind, but with eyes that held profound kindness. The midwife who had delivered half of Narragansett Point's children, her capable hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Porter leading Sunday school with gentle authority. Violet bent over a book with fierce concentration. Women of worth whom society never bothered to paint. She called the collection Unseen Portraits, images that insisted on visibility for those the world habitually overlooked. One evening in late May of her 5th year, 5 years almost to the day since the Ashford Ball, Serafina stood on the cliffs above Rosemont as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The wind pulled her hair loose from its pins, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. Under her arm, she carried a stack of new primers she'd purchased from the sale of her last Boston gown. Behind her, smoke rose from Rosemont's chimneys. The manor was no longer cold and abandoned. It was warm, alive, a home, her home. In Boston, society danced on oblivious. Dominic Thorne attended balls and managed estates and never spoke of plain girls he'd dismissed. But in a small Rhode Island village, in a converted barn, in a clifftop manor, and the hungry minds of fishermen's daughters, a revolution of quiet minds was beginning. And Seraphina Grace Whitmore, forgotten, dismissed, exiled, stood at its center, finally gloriously free. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May 1868, delivered by the mail coach along with a parcel of new books for the Academy. Seraphina recognized the Boston solicitor's seal before she opened it, and her stomach tightened with inexplicable dread. Dear Miss Whitmore, it is my unfortunate duty to inform you that Mr. Theodore Whitmore passed away on the 14th instant following a brief illness. The memorial service will be held at Trinity Church, Boston on the 3rd of June. Your presence is requested as his sole surviving child. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience regarding matters of the estate. Your obedient servant, Mr. Gerald Whitmore, Solicitor. Seraphina read the letter twice, waiting for grief to arrive. Instead, she felt a complex tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. Sadness, yes, but not for the father who had existed. Rather for the father who might have existed, who might have loved her, defended her, seen her worth. That father had never been real. She was mourning a fiction. She stood on the cliffs that evening, the letter still in her hand, watching the sun set over the endless sea. I have to go back, she said to the wind, to the waves, to herself, not because she owed Boston anything, not because she sought their approval, but because the girl she had been 5 years ago deserved to see what she had become, deserved to walk into that city with her head high, carrying the proof that their dismissal had been wrong. Mrs. Wells found her there as darkness fell. You'll go then, the older woman asked gently. Yes, but not as the girl they banished. Seraphina's voice was steady, certain. As the woman I've become, let them see what they discarded. The decision made Seraphina felt something settle in her chest. Peace, perhaps, or purpose. She would return to Boston. Would face Vivian in society, and even perhaps Dominic Thorne. But she would face them as someone new, someone who knew her worth. And that made all the difference. The journey back to Boston took 3 days, reversing the path Seraphina had traveled 5 years before. But everything was different now. Then she had watched the landscape through tears, each mile taking her further from humiliation toward unknown exile. Now she observed with clear eyes, noting how the wild beauty of Rhode Island's coast gradually gave way to Massachusetts farmland, and finally to the ordered streets and smoking chimneys of the city. She was not the same woman who had left. Mrs. Wells had insisted on accompanying her, and Seraphina was grateful. The older woman sat across from her in the hired coach, knitting, steadily, her presence a quiet anchor. You're nervous, Mrs. Wells observed without looking up from her needles. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you. To them, she nodded toward the approaching city. You'll seem perfectly composed. You've learned that well enough. Seraphina touched the simple travel dress she wore, deep blue wool. Wool well made but without ornamentation. Her hair was arranged in a style that was elegant in its simplicity, pulled back to reveal her face rather than hide it. Around her neck, her mother's pearls. I'm not afraid of them anymore, Seraphina said, surprising herself with the truth of it. I'm just curious about who I'll find when I get there. Whether they've changed at all or if it's only me. It's only you, Mrs. Wells said with certainty. People like that don't change. They just get older and meaner. The coach turned onto Beacon Street, and Seraphina's breath caught despite herself. Whitmore House stood exactly as she remembered it, elegant Georgian facade, black iron railings, windows that reflected the afternoon sun like judging eyes. The door opened before they reached it. Stevens, the butler who had served the household for decades, stood in the entrance. His eyes flickered over Seraphina, without recognition at first, then widened slightly. Lady Seraphina, his voice held genuine surprise. Welcome home. The word home landed awkwardly, like something that didn't quite fit. Thank you, Stevens. This is Mrs. Wells, my companion. Please see that she's given comfortable accommodations. Of course, my lady. Lady Vivian is indisposed at present, but we'll see you at dinner. I'll show you to your room. Not her old bedroom on the 3rd floor where she'd spent her girlhood, Seraphina noted as Stevens led them upstairs. Instead, a guest room on the 2nd floor, larger, better appointed, but unmistakably temporary. The message was clear. You are a visitor now, not a resident. The distinction didn't wound her, as Vivian doubtless intended. If anything, it reinforced what Seraphina already knew. She didn't belong here anymore. She had somewhere else to belong. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. The table, absurdly large for two people, gleamed with silver and crystal. An elaborate meal appeared, course by course: consommé fish in cream sauce, roasted duck, vegetables, and butter desserts Serafina couldn't identify. It was the kind of ostentatious display that Boston society considered normal, and that now struck Serafina as grotesque. She thought of her students in Rhode Island, fishermen's families, who worked hard for simple meals, and felt something close to disgust. Vivienne sat at the head of the table in black morning silk that somehow made her look more vibrant rather than less. At 45, she remained beautiful in the way of expensive thing, carefully maintained, her skin preserved through creams, her figure corseted into fashionable shape, her hair arranged with meticulous art. Her eyes raked over Serafina with an assessment that couldn't quite conceal surprise. "How provincial you've become, Serafina," Vivienne said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that preceded cruelty. "That dress is certainly simple. I suppose Rhode Island standards differ from civilized society." 5 years ago, the comment would have made Serafina shrink into herself. Now she simply smiled calmly and took a sip of wine. "Rhode Island standards value substance over ornamentation," she replied evenly. "I found it refreshing." Vivienne's fork paused halfway to her mouth. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face, as if the script she'd used for years no longer applied. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "I suppose 5 years of isolation would give one peculiar ideas about propriety." "5 years of purpose," Serafina corrected gently. "I've been quite occupied with my academy." "Ah, yes, your little educational project. How quaint." Serafina let the dismissal pass without response. Engaging with Vivienne's barbs gave them power. Silence rendered them impotent. They ate in uncomfortable quiet, punctuated by the clink of silverware against china. Finally, Vivienne spoke again, her tone studiedly casual. "The memorial service is in 2 days, Tuesday at 11 Trinity Church. You're expected to attend naturally, though you understand that public addresses from women are unseemly. The Reverend will deliver the eulogy. If the Reverend requests my participation, I'll honor Father's memory as I see fit," Serafina said quietly. Vivienne's eyes narrowed. "You've become quite bold in your exile." "I've become honest. There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. Then Vivienne continued with studied casualness. "Everyone of importance will attend, of course. The Thornberrys, the Ashfords, Henry Blackwood, and his wife. Even Dominic Thorne has confirmed his attendance." Serafina's fingers tightened momentarily on her wineglass. Her breathing paused just for a heartbeat. Then composure returned, smooth as glass over troubled water. "I see," she said. Vivienne smiled, satisfied at having landed a blow. "I thought you should be prepared. It would be unfortunate if you were overcome by unexpected encounters. How thoughtful of you to be concerned." The sarcasm was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but Vivienne heard it. Her mouth thinned into an angry line. "You may excuse yourself, Serafina. I find I've lost my appetite." Serafina rose with grace, nodded politely, and left the dining room without another word. But that night, alone in the guest room with Boston's noise drifting through her window, her calm facade cracked slightly. She would see him again. Dominic Thorne, the man whose casual cruelty had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Did it still hurt? She probed the memory carefully, like testing a healed wound. There was tenderness, yes, the ghost of old pain. But the sharp bleeding agony had scabbed over, scarred, become something she'd survived rather than something that defined her. She could face him. She would face him, and his opinion, whatever it might be, no longer had the power to destroy her. The next morning, Serafina escaped Whitmore House, desperate for air and solitude. She found herself drawn by muscle memory to Brattle Bookshop on Washington Street, a labyrinth of shelves where she'd spent countless hours in her youth. The store was exactly as she remembered, the smell of leather and paper, blessed quiet, broken only by the occasional turning page. She wandered the philosophy section, running her fingers along familiar spines, and felt something in her chest ease. This at least hadn't changed. She rounded a corner toward the political theory section and nearly collided with a tall figure reaching for the same volume she'd been about to select. Mills on Liberty. Their hands hovered over the same book, not quite touching. Time stopped. Serafina looked up and found herself staring into gray eyes she hadn't seen in 5 years. Eyes that had dismissed her with casual cruelty. Eyes that now widened with recognition and something that looked almost like fear. Dominic Ashford Thorne stood before her, dressed in charcoal gray, impeccably tailored. He looked exactly and nothing like she remembered. The same aristocratic bearing, the same dark hair, but there were lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. a haunted quality in his expression, as if he'd aged more than 5 years in the time they'd been apart. Lady Seraphina, he said. His voice came out rougher than she remembered catching slightly on her name. Mr. Thorne. She kept her tone carefully neutral. Silence expanded between them like something physical. Around them, the bookshop continued its quiet business. Other customers browsing pages, turning completely unaware of the earthquake happening in aisle 3. Dominic's hand dropped from the book. I I heard of your father's passing. My condolences. Thank you. More silence. She could see him struggling, words forming and dying on his lips before he could speak them. Finally, carefully, as if walking across ice, I understand you've been in Rhode Island. I hope the time was not unpleasant. Something in the phrasing, the careful neutrality, the studied politeness sparked a small flame of anger in Seraphina's chest. Rhode Island was transformative, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice measured, but with an edge he couldn't miss. I found purpose there that Boston never offered me. She watched him absorb the implicit critique, saw him recognize it, flinch from it. I'm glad to hear it. The words were inadequate, and he knew it. His jaw tightened with frustration at his own inability to say what he clearly wanted to say. Seraphina took the mill volume from the shelf, the movement deliberate, claiming what she'd come for. If you'll excuse me, I have much to prepare before the memorial. Seraphina. He stopped, seeming to realize he had no right to use her Christian name. Lady Seraphina, I wanted to say that as I've thought about, she met his eyes directly. Let him see that she was no longer the girl who could be wounded by his dismissal. Mr. Thorne, whatever you think you owe me, I release you from the debt. I hold no grudge against you. But you should, he said, the words bursting out with sudden vehemence. I was unconscionably cruel. I stood by while you were humiliated, banished, treated as... Yes, Seraphina agreed simply. You were and you did. The directness of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. But my healing cannot come from your guilt, she continued, her voice gentler now. Nor my peace from your apology. I've built a life I'm proud of. What you did or didn't do 5 years ago no longer has power over me. Dominic looked at her with something that might have been desperation. It has power over me, every day, every hour. I see your face that night, and I cannot escape what I've done. For the first time in the conversation, Seraphina truly looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected: genuine anguish. This wasn't performative guilt. This was a man who had been eating himself alive. Her voice softened slightly. Then perhaps you should examine why you did it, Mr. Thorne. Not for my benefit, but for your own. Why does a man of intelligence and power choose cruelty over kindness? What fear drives that choice? Before he could respond, before she could say anything more, a familiar voice cut through the moment like a knife through silk. Mr. Thorne, what a delightful surprise. A man swept into the aisle, tall, elegant, perhaps 42, dressed in impeccable European fashion. His warm brown eyes found Seraphina immediately, and his face lit with genuine pleasure. Lady Seraphina, I had hoped to find you in Boston. What extraordinary fortune. Mr. Laurent, Seraphina said, unable to suppress a small smile. I didn't expect to see you here. Dominic's eyes darted between them, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. You two are acquainted, he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I had the pleasure of meeting Lady Seraphina 3 months ago, Philippe Laurent said smoothly, his English accented but perfect, at a small gallery exhibition in Providence. Her remarkable paintings quite captured my attention. He turned to Seraphina, his focus complete and flattering. I've come to Boston specifically to propose that you exhibit your Unseen series here in a proper metropolitan gallery. Your work deserves wider recognition than Rhode Island can provide. That's very kind, but... And I've also come, Philippe continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, to continue our conversation about collaboration. The possibility of expanding your educational model to other cities, perhaps even to Paris. Dominic's hands clenched at his sides. I see. How enterprising. Philippe seemed to notice the tension for the first time. He looked between them with sudden understanding, then offered a gracious smile. Forgive me for interrupting what seems to be a private conversation. Lady Seraphina, might I call on you this afternoon? I'm staying at the Parker House. We could discuss the exhibition over tea. Yes, that would be acceptable. Excellent. Until this afternoon, then. He bowed to both of them and departed, leaving a charged silence in his wake. Dominic stared after him, something like panic flickering across his carefully controlled features. You're courting him, he said, not quite a question. Mr. Laurent and I have discussed potential professional collaboration, Serafina corrected. He's been very supportive of my work. For 3 months. Yes. And in 3 months, he's shown more interest in your work than Boston Society showed in 22 years. The bitterness in his voice was startling. Serafina studied him, trying to understand what she was seeing. Mr. Thorne, I don't owe you explanations about my associations. No, you don't. He took a breath, visibly steadying himself. I have no right to ask, no right to anything concerning you. Then why does it seem to bother you? The question hung between them. Dominic met her eyes, and for a moment she saw past all his careful control to something raw and desperate underneath. Because I've realized too late what I failed to see. And now someone else, someone better, someone who valued you from the beginning is offering you everything I was too blind to recognize you deserved. Serafina's breath caught. This was not what she'd expected. Not from him, not here. Mr. Thorne, I know I have no right to ask, he said again, his voice low and urgent. But please, Serafina, give me a chance to truly know you now. Not the girl I dismissed, but the woman you've become. Not to earn your forgiveness, I don't deserve that. But to understand what I missed. What I lost through my own stupidity. She should refuse, should walk away, should protect herself from the possibility of being hurt again. But something in his expression stopped her. A vulnerability she'd never seen before. And beneath her wariness, beneath her hard-won self-protection, curiosity stirred. Who had he become in 5 years? Had he truly changed, or was this merely guilt speaking? I'm in Boston for 1 week, she said finally. The memorial is in 2 days. After that, I return to Rhode Island. 1 week, he repeated. Then, may I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps I won't ask for forgiveness. I just want to understand. To see clearly what I was too blind to see before. Serafina considered, weighed risks against curiosity. Finally, carefully, she nodded. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. But understand, Mr. Thorne, I'm not the girl who needed your approval 5 years ago. I'm not looking for rescue or your validation. If you call on me, it will be as equals or not at all. I would want nothing less. She nodded once more, then gathered her book and left him standing among the shelves, looking both hopeful and terrified. Outside in the bright June sunshine, Serafina's heart raced. What had she just agreed to? Was she foolish to give him even this small opening? But beneath the uncertainty, something else stirred, something that felt almost like possibility. The Parker House Hotel dining room was elegant in the way Boston establishments prided themselves on tasteful, rather than ostentatious, with crisp white linens and discreet service. Philippe had secured a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the city street beyond the windows. He stood when Serafina arrived, pulling out her chair with old-world courtesy. You look troubled, he observed once they'd ordered tea. The encounter in the bookshop, perhaps? Serafina smiled ruefully. Is it that obvious? Only to someone paying attention, and I confess I pay a great deal of attention where you're concerned. He said it lightly, but his eyes were serious. The gentleman Thorne, he's the one, isn't he, from the story you told me in Providence? The one who dismissed you. She told Philippe about her exile during their third meeting 3 months ago. He listened without judgment, then said simply, their blindness became your liberation. That's the paradox of cruelty. Sometimes it frees us to become who we were meant to be. Now she nodded. Yes, that was him. And he wishes to apologize. Among other things, Philippe poured tea with elegant precision. May I speak frankly? I would prefer it. Men like him, men of power who've caused harm, often seek forgiveness, not because they've changed, but because guilt is uncomfortable. They want absolution so they can stop feeling bad about themselves. I know. But, Philippe continued thoughtfully, occasionally, very rarely, such men genuinely transform. The guilt becomes not something to escape, but something to learn from. They don't seek to be forgiven so much as to understand their own capacity for cruelty so they might become better. How does one tell the difference? Time, action, consistency. He met her eyes, which brings me to why I came to Boston. He withdrew a sheaf of papers from his jacket. The Tremont Gallery has agreed to host your Unseen Portraits series, a month-long exhibition opening next week if you consent. The director saw the pieces I photographed in Providence and was quite enthusiastic. Serafina stared at the contracts. Next week, but I took the liberty of having the paintings shipped from Rhode Island. They arrived yesterday. He smiled at her expression. Presumptuous, I know, But Serafina Boston needs to see these works. This city honored beauty that conforms wealth that dazzles. Your paintings honor worth that society overlooks. That's necessary. That's revolutionary. She looked at the exhibition proposal, her mind racing. A Boston exhibition would mean staying longer, would mean facing not just Dominic but all of society, would mean exposing her most vulnerable work to the very people who'd dismissed her. I also, Philippe said softly, wish to discuss the other matter, the partnership. Philippe, hear me out. He leaned forward earnest. I've spent 3 months observing your work, Serafina. Your educational model could transform lives across Europe. I have connections in Paris and Lyon, in Brussels. We could establish a network of academies, places where women of all classes could access real education. Not finishing schools designed to make them ornamental, but institutions that develop their minds. That's an extraordinary vision. It requires an extraordinary partner to realize it. Someone who understands both the practical pedagogy and the moral imperative. He paused. I'm offering you partnership, Serafina. Equal partnership in creating something that could outlast us both. And the personal aspect, she asked quietly. I won't lie and pretend my interest is purely professional. I admire you greatly, your mind, your conviction, your courage. I would be honored if over time you came to see me as more than a colleague. He smiled slightly. But I'm a patient man, and I'm realistic. If all you ever offer me is professional collaboration, I'll count myself fortunate. Because working alongside you, building schools that matter, creating change, that would be enough. It was everything she'd ever wanted. Respect without conditions, partnership without rescue. The chance to expand her work beyond Rhode Island's borders. And Philippe himself, intelligent, kind, uncomplicated by painful history. Safe. You're offering me Paris, she said. Education reform, a clean slate. I'm offering you the world that deserves you, not the one that dismissed you. Serafina looked out the window at Boston's busy streets. Somewhere in this city, Dominic Thorne was wrestling with ghosts. Vivian was plotting her next cruelty. Society was preparing to judge her again. And yet, I need time, she said. The memorial is in 2 days. The exhibition, if I agree to it, would be next week. Give me until after the memorial to decide. Philippe nodded, unsurprised. Of course. But know this, Serafina, whatever you decide about the exhibition or the partnership or anything else, you'll decide it freely. I'll never pressure you. I'll never use my resources or connections to manipulate your choice. You have my word on that. It was the same thing he'd said in Providence, the quality that had drawn her to him initially. Philippe offered power without control, support without strings. Why then did she find herself thinking about gray eyes in a bookshop, about a man who'd finally learned to see clearly and was devastated by what he saw? They parted with an agreement that she'd give her answer within the week. As Serafina walked back to Whitmore House, she felt the weight of choices pressing down on her shoulders. One man offered her the past, transformed the possibility of redemption, of understanding of love, built on the ruins of cruelty. The other offered her the future, uncomplicated, respect, partnership, expansion of her life's work without the burden of painful history. Both were possible. Neither was simple. And in 2 days, she would have to face them both at her father's memorial, in front of all of Boston society, and somehow find a way to honor the girl she'd been while becoming the woman she was meant to be. That evening, Vivian announced at dinner that she'd organized a small gathering for the following afternoon. Just a few close friends, she said, her smile sharp enough to cut. I thought it would be nice to properly reintroduce you to society before the memorial. I've already sent the invitations. I appreciate the thought, Serafina said carefully, but I'm not interested in... Oh, but I've already confirmed with everyone. It would be terribly awkward to cancel now. Vivian's eyes glittered with malice poorly disguised as innocence. Besides, Mr. Thorne specifically accepted. I thought you'd want to see him again, given your history. Serafina set down her fork with deliberate care. You invited Dominic Thorne to a gathering meant to reintroduce me to society. Well, he's been so generous to your little school, it would be rude not to include him. The words hit like ice water. What do you mean generous? Oh, didn't you know? Vivian's smile widened. The anonymous donations funding your Rhode Island Academy. They've been coming from Thorne for years. Quite the guilty conscience he has. $300 quarterly if the rumors are accurate. Serafina's mind raced. The donations. The mysterious benefactor who'd enabled Rosemont Academy's expansion. It had been Dominic all along. I see I've surprised you, Vivian said with satisfaction. Yes, dear stepmother, it seems Mr. Thorne has been watching over you from afar. How touching. Though one wonders if his sudden interest is genuine remorse or simply fear of competition now that the French gentleman has appeared. She rose from the table. The gathering is tomorrow at 3. Do try to wear something presentable. First impressions matter, even second times around. Alone in the dining room, Serafina stared at her untouched meal, her thoughts in turmoil. Dominic had funded her school for years, in secret. While she'd been teaching herself to forget him, to build a life independent of his opinion or anyone else's, he'd been, watching supporting from shadows. Trying to make amends without having the courage to face her directly. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or furious, whether it changed anything or changed nothing. And tomorrow she would have to face him again, this time, in front of the very society that had witnessed her humiliation 5 years before. Vivian's trap was perfect. She'd maneuvered Serafina into exactly the position she'd been trying to avoid: vulnerable, observed, forced to perform for an audience that delighted in her discomfort. But as Serafina sat in the growing darkness, something hardened in her chest. A determination born not of anger, but of clarity. Let Vivian set her trap. Let society gather to observe. Let Dominic reveal his secret support and whatever motivations drove it. She was not the girl they remembered. She would not break under scrutiny. She would not shrink or apologize or seek their approval. Tomorrow she would show them exactly what 5 years of freedom had built. Not for their sake, but for the sake of the girl who'd walked out of the Ashford ballroom with her head high and her dignity intact. That girl deserved to be vindicated, and Serafina intended to give her that gift. That night, Serafina stood before the mirror in her guest room, examining not her reflection, but her resolve. Mrs. Wells knocked and entered carrying a dress box. "This arrived from the dressmaker," she said, "the one you commissioned before we left Rhode Island." Together they lifted out the gown, deep blue silk that matched Serafina's eyes with clean lines and minimal ornamentation. It was elegant in its simplicity, making no apologies for what it wasn't. A dress that said quietly but firmly, "I am enough." "You're going into battle," Mrs. Wells observed, helping her try it on. "Not battle, just truth." "Same thing often enough." The older woman adjusted the fit across Serafina's shoulders. "You know what she's trying to do, don't you? Your stepmother. She wants to recreate that night 5 years ago. Wants to see you humiliated again." "I know. And the gentleman, Mr. Thorne." Serafina was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what he wants, or what I want from him, but I know I won't let anyone, not him, not Vivian, not society, define me by their opinions anymore." "Good girl," Mrs. Wells smiled. "You've learned the most important lesson. The only opinion that matters is your own." After Mrs. Wells left, Serafina sat at the small writing desk and pulled out her journal, the one she'd kept faithfully for 5 years, recording her transformation from Excel to educator. She wrote, "Tomorrow I face them, not seeking vindication, though if it comes I'll accept it. Not seeking revenge, though justice would be welcome. I face them to prove to myself that their judgment no longer has power over me, that I built something real from the ruins of their dismissal. Whatever happens tomorrow, I know this. I am not the girl they called forgettable. I never was. I was just early." She closed the journal and went to bed. Sleep came easier than expected. And if she dreamed of gray eyes and bookshops and choices that would shape the rest of her life, well, at least they were dreams she chose to have, not nightmares imposed from outside. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. But tonight, Serafina Grace Whitmore rested in the certainty of her own worth, and that she'd learned over 5 hard years was the only armor she truly needed. The drawing room of Whitmore House had been transformed for the occasion. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating arrangements of white roses and lilies. Silver tea service gleamed on mahogany side tables. 20 chairs had been arranged in intimate clusters, close enough for conversation, strategic enough for observation. Vivian had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a general planning a siege. Serafina descended the stairs at precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Wells a reassuring presence one step behind. The deep blue silk whispered against her legs with each measured step. Her mother's pearls rested cool against her throat. Her hair was arranged, simply pulled back to reveal rather than hide her face. She looked exactly like herself, and that she'd learned was enough. The guests had already arrived. Serafina catalogued them as she entered: Lady Thornbury in emerald green, her daughter Cecilia beside her, Mrs. Ashford and her circle of matrons, Henry Blackwood and his wife, looking vaguely uncomfortable, various other members of Boston society whose names Serafina had once memorized and now found she couldn't quite remember. And there, standing near the fireplace with studied casualness, Dominic Thorne. Their eyes met across the room. His widened slightly, whether at her appearance or her composure, she couldn't tell. She gave him the briefest of nods, then turned her attention to her stepmother. Vivian swept forward in black silk that somehow emphasized her vitality rather than her mourning. "My dear stepdaughter," she announced to the assembled room, her voice carrying that particular projection that meant she wished to be overheard by all. "How wonderful that you could join us. I was just telling everyone about your rustic pursuits in Rhode Island. Such a quaint little educational project you've undertaken." Serafina met her stepmother's gaze calmly. "The Rosemont Academy has been quite fulfilling, yes. 30 students now ranging from 8 to 45 years old. We teach reading, writing, arithmetic, sciences, and household economy." "How charitable," Lady Thornbury murmured, "to spend one's time with fishermen's daughters." "Educational," Serafina corrected gently, "and mutually so. They've taught me as much as I've taught them about resilience, determination, and the hunger for knowledge that exists regardless of social station." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. This was not the response they'd expected. Not defensive, not apologetic, simply stated. Vivian's smile tightened. "Yes, well, we're all fascinated by your transformation. 5 years does change a person, doesn't it? Though I must say some things never change." Her pause was calculated, poisonous. "Mr. Thorne was just sharing with us his own charitable inclinations. Haven't you been supporting educational causes, Mr. Thorne?" Every eye turned to Dominic. He stood very still, a muscle working in his jaw. "I have," he said quietly, "including, I believe, a certain academy in Rhode Island." Vivian's voice dripped false innocence. "How generous. One might almost call it penance." The word hung in the air like smoke. Serafina felt the room's attention shift between her and Dominic, eager for drama, hungry for blood. They wanted to see her react, to be hurt or angry or grateful, or any emotion they could dissect and discuss later over their own tea tables. She would not give them that satisfaction. "Many people have supported Rosemont Academy," she said calmly. "Some with money, some with labor, some with their trust in sending daughters and wives to learn. I'm grateful to all of them, known and anonymous alike. The school exists not because of any single benefactor, but because the community believed education mattered more than social convention." It was a deflection, graceful and complete. Vivian's eyes flashed with frustration. "How diplomatic," she said. "But surely you must have wondered about your mysterious patron. Didn't you wish to know who was watching over you from afar?" Before Serafina could answer, Dominic spoke. His voice was low, but carried clearly through the suddenly silent room. "Lady Vivian, I think you're laboring under a misapprehension." All eyes turned to him. "I did support Lady Serafina's academy financially, but I wasn't watching over her." He looked directly at Serafina, his gray eyes holding something that looked almost like pain. "I was watching her accomplish what I could never do, turn dismissal into purpose, cruelty into creation. I didn't fund the school to ease my guilt, though I have abundant guilt. I funded it because what she was building deserved to exist, regardless of my feelings about it." The honesty of it was startling. Serafina felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first hairline crack in the wall she'd built against him. Vivian, sensing her plan going awry, pressed harder. "How noble. Though one does wonder." "Lady Vivian," Dominic interrupted, his voice taking on an edge Serafina had never heard before. "With respect, I believe we're all here, ostensibly to support Lady Serafina during her time of loss. Perhaps we might actually do that rather than using her father's death as an excuse for social theater." Shocked silence fell. A man of Dominic's position didn't speak to ladies, even ladies he disliked, with such directness. It simply wasn't done. Henry Blackwood cleared his throat. "Thorne's right. This feels less like a gathering and more like—" He trailed off, too polite to finish. "An ambush," his wife completed crisply. "Really, Vivian, this is beneath even you." Vivian's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She'd expected Serafina to crumble, expected Dominic to remain passive, expected society to enjoy the spectacle. Instead, she was being criticized by the very people she'd assembled as her audience. And then from an unexpected quarter came the killing blow: Henrietta Walsh. Lady Thornbury's pale, quiet companion stood up from her corner chair. She was perhaps 30, plain in the way society used the word, someone who'd spent her life being invisible in rooms full of important people. "Forgive me," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "but I can't stay silent anymore." Every head turned toward her. "I was employed in this household 5 years ago." Henrietta continued, gathering strength as she spoke. "I was a maid then, and I heard things. I heard Lady Vivian and Senator Ashford. I heard them planning. I heard her say that Lady Serafina had to be sent away because she might inadvertently reveal their affair, that it would be easier to eliminate the potential witness than to end the relationship. The silence that followed was absolute. That's a lie. Vivian's composure shattered completely. How dare you? I heard the rumors too, Mrs. Ashford said quietly from her corner. We all did. We simply chose to ignore them out of courtesy. But Robert Senator Ashford was quite indiscreet before his death last year. There was talk, substantial talk. One by one, other voices joined, confirming, acknowledging what they'd all known but never said. The affair that had been an open secret, the manipulation that had resulted in Serafina's exile. The room turned on Vivian like a pack scenting blood. In Boston society, a widow having an affair was scandalous. But orchestrating a stepdaughter's banishment to conceal it, using a vulnerable girl as a pawn in a sordid game, that was unforgivable. Guests began making excuses, gathering their things, distancing themselves from Vivian's toxic reputation with the ruthless efficiency that Boston society had perfected. Within 10 minutes, the drawing room had emptied, everyone departing with cold nods and promises they both knew would never be kept. Everyone except Dominic and Henry Blackwood, who stood near the door, as if uncertain whether to stay or go. Vivian fled upstairs without a word, her social standing in ruins. And Serafina stood in the center of the drawing room, surrounded by the wreckage of her stepmother's ambush, feeling not triumph but something closer to exhaustion. I didn't want this, she said quietly to no one in particular. I didn't come to Boston seeking revenge. Perhaps justice finds its own way, Dominic offered softly. Serafina looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since entering the room. He appeared almost as shaken as she felt. Why did you defend me? She asked. You could have stayed silent. Let Vivian have her moment. It would have been safer for you. Because I've been silent before when you needed defense. His voice was rough with emotion. I won't make that mistake again. Not ever. Henry Blackwood cleared his throat tactfully. We should go, Thorne. Let Lady Serafina have some peace. But before they could leave, Serafina heard herself say, wait. Both men turned. She looked at Dominic. You said you wanted to understand, to see clearly what you'd missed before. Yes. Then come to the memorial tomorrow, and after we'll talk. Truly talk. No society watching, no performances. Just honesty. Something like hope flickered across Dominic's face. I'll be there. They departed, leaving Serafina alone in the silent drawing room with Mrs. Wells, who'd observed everything from her position near the windows. That was quite a show, the older woman said dryly. I didn't orchestrate it. No, but you handled it well. Kept your head, kept your dignity. That stepmother of yours learned a hard lesson today. When you try to destroy someone who's already survived you, once you're likely to destroy yourself instead. Serafina sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What have I done, Mrs. Wells, agreeing to talk with him? Opening that door again. Given yourself a choice, that's all. You can listen to what he has to say and decide if it's genuine, or you can listen and decide it doesn't matter anymore. Either way, you're in control, she smiled. That's what's really changed, you know. Not your face or your circumstances, but the fact that you're the one making the choices now. Nobody else. Trinity Church on Summer Street was packed for Theodore Whitmore's memorial service. 200 mourners filled the pews, less out of affection for the deceased than out of social obligation, and Serafina suspected morbid curiosity about the family drama that had erupted the previous afternoon. News of Vivian's exposure had spread through Boston society like wildfire. Serafina sat in the front pew, flanked by Mrs. Wells, in an empty space where Vivian should have been. Her stepmother had sent word that morning that she was too distraught to attend. In reality, she couldn't face the congregation's judgment. The service proceeded with familiar rhythm, hymns sung by voices that had never known her father, prayers recited with practiced emptiness. The Reverend droned through a generic eulogy emphasizing virtues Theodore Whitmore had never actually possessed. Serafina listened with half her attention, the other half acutely aware of Dominic's presence several rows back. She'd seen him arrive impeccably dressed in black, his face solemn. He'd met her eyes briefly conveying something she couldn't quite read. Support, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. Philippe had arrived as well, she noticed. He sat toward the middle, his presence elegant and unobtrusive. When their eyes met, he'd nodded with quiet understanding. No pressure, no demands, just steady support. Two men offering such different futures. Two paths diverging in a wood, and she still didn't know which one to take. The Reverend finished his eulogy and was preparing to move into closing prayers when Serafina found herself standing. The movement was instinctive, unplanned. She simply rose from her seat and moved toward the pulpit. A ripple of shock moved through the congregation. Women did not speak at memorial services. It simply wasn't done. The Reverend looked at her with alarm. Lady Seraphina, I don't think my father deserves honesty in death, she said quietly, firmly. May I speak? He hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and the fact that she was technically the chief mourner. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he stepped aside. Seraphina stood before 200 of Boston's finest and felt a strange calm settle over her. These people had judged her, dismissed her, forgotten her. Their opinions had once meant everything. Now they meant nothing at all. My father was not a perfect man, she began, her voice clear and carrying. I won't claim otherwise. To do so would dishonor his memory with pretty lies. Gasps, scandalized whispers. She ignored them. Theodore Whitmore was a man of his time and class with all the limitations that implies. He gambled. He made poor choices. He remarried unwisely. He allowed his second wife to exile his only child because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths. The church was absolutely silent now. But he also gave me life, and what I've done with that life, the school I've built, the students I've taught, the woman I've become, that has been entirely my own choice. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I learned from his absence to value presence, from his silence to value voice, from his inability to see me clearly to see myself with honesty. These were hard lessons, painful lessons, but they were necessary. Her eyes moved across the congregation, touching briefly on familiar faces. Lady Thornbury, Mrs. Ashford, Cecilia, Henry Blackwood, and finally, inevitably, Dominic. Many of you haven't thought of me in 5 years, she continued. Some don't remember me at all. And I've discovered something liberating about being forgotten. It frees you to become someone worth remembering. Not for others' sake, but for your own. She saw Dominic's throat work, his hands gripping the pew in front of him. My father's greatest gift to me was inadvertent. By failing to protect me, he forced me to protect myself. By failing to value me, he taught me to find my own worth. By allowing me to be exiled, he gave me the freedom to discover who I truly was. Seraphina's voice softened slightly. I forgive him. Not because he asked for forgiveness, he never did, but because holding on to anger about things I cannot change serves no purpose. The past cannot be altered. But the future, she smiled slightly, the future is entirely unwritten. She returned to her seat in absolute silence. The Reverend, clearly shaken, hurried through the closing prayers. The congregation filed out in stunned quiet. Nobody quite sure what they'd just witnessed. Was it scandalous? Absolutely. Would it be talked about for months without question? Did Seraphina care? Not even slightly. After the service, as mourners gathered outside the church in small clusters, Dominic found his way to Seraphina's side. That was remarkable, he said quietly. It was honest. Yes, it was. He paused. You said we could talk after. Is the offer still open? She looked at him, this man who'd wounded her so deeply, who'd apparently spent 5 years trying to make amends, who'd defended her yesterday when silence would have been easier. There's a park 2 blocks from here, public enough to be proper, private enough for conversation. I know it. 20 minutes. That should give me time to escape the well-wishers. He nodded and walked away to where Henry Blackwood waited with his carriage. Philippe approached next, reading her expression with the ease of someone who'd learned to observe carefully. You're going to talk with him, he said, not a question. I am. And you need to do this before you can decide about the exhibition, about Paris, about anything else. Yes. Philippe smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I understand, truly. Unfinished business has a way of haunting us until we address it. He took her hand briefly. Whatever you decide, Seraphina, know that my offer stands. Today, tomorrow, a month from now. I'm a patient man. You're a good man. I try to be, though I confess in this moment I wish I were a selfish one who'd met you first before all the complications. He released her hand. Go. Have your conversation. Find your clarity. I'll be at the Parker house if you need me. He departed with characteristic grace, leaving Seraphina feeling both grateful for his understanding and guilty for the relief she felt at his absence. Mrs. Wells appeared at her elbow. I'll return to Whitmore House. You take the time you need. Thank you for everything. Just remember you don't owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not a second chance. Whatever you give freely, because you choose to not, because he deserves it. I'll remember. 20 minutes later, Seraphina walked through the iron gates of the small public park. It was well-maintained, manicured lawns, flowering trees, benches positioned at discrete intervals, a place where respectable people could meet without impropriety. Dominic stood beside a fountain, staring at the water without seeming to see it. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck again by how much older he seemed, not just in years but in bearing, as if he'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said you wanted to talk. To understand, so talk. Help me understand why you did what you did 5 years ago." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, as if testing different words and finding them all inadequate. "Finally, my mother was considered plain by my father's standards. Not ugly, just unremarkable. He married her for her dowry and connections, then spent their entire marriage making her aware of his disappointment." Serafina's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. "He kept mistresses," Dominic continued, his voice rough. "Beautiful women, all of them. He paraded them through our home while my mother withered away in the country deemed unfit for society. She died when I was 15. Lonely, forgotten, convinced she was worthless because the man she'd married told her so. Oh my Dominic, I watched him destroy a good woman because society mocked her appearance, and I swore I would never be like him. Never marry someone society considered plain, never risk appearing weak by valuing things the world deemed worthless." His laugh was bitter. "Instead, I became exactly like him. I destroyed someone kind because I was terrified of being seen as my father, a man who married beneath him and paid for it socially." Understanding dawned painful and complete. "You weren't dismissing me. You were dismissing your mother, trying to prove you were different from your father by becoming him." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper, and by the time I realized what I'd done, you were gone, exiled, and I had to live with the knowledge that I'd failed the one test that mattered, being better than the man who'd destroyed my mother. Serafina sat down on a nearby bench, her legs suddenly unsteady. Dominic remained standing as if he didn't deserve the comfort of sitting. "The donations," she said, "the anonymous support, was that guilt or something else?" "Both, neither." He finally sat, but at a careful distance. "I hired an investigator to ensure you were safe well. When I learned you were teaching, I don't know the word, awed perhaps, that you'd taken the worst thing that happened to you and turned it into something meaningful. So you gave money. It was the only thing I could do from a distance. The only way I could support what you were building without presuming I had any right to be part of it." He looked at her directly. "I didn't do it to ease my guilt, though I hoped it might. I did it because you were doing something that mattered, and I wanted it to succeed regardless of my feelings about it." Serafina studied him, searching for dishonesty and finding only raw truth. "You could have revealed yourself at any time," she said. "Could have claimed credit, forced me to acknowledge the debt. You didn't owe me debt. If anything, I owed you restitution for what I'd taken your place in society, your sense of safety, years of your life spent in exile. Those years made me who I am. I know, which is why I can't even take comfort in the idea that my cruelty led to your growth. You grew despite me, not because of me. You would have been extraordinary regardless. I was just too blind to see it." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching fountain water catch the afternoon light. "What do you want from me, Dominic?" Serafina asked finally. "Forgiveness, absolution, permission to stop feeling guilty. None of those things? Or all of them?" "I don't know." He turned to face her fully. "I want to know you, the woman you've become. I want to understand how someone survives what I did to you and emerges stronger rather than broken. I want—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I want to be worthy of your regard, not your love, not even your friendship necessarily, just your respect. The chance to prove I'm not the man who dismissed you, that I can be better. And if I can't give you that, if the hurt is too deep, the history too complicated, then I'll live with it. I'll continue to support your work from a distance without credit or acknowledgement. I'll become the man I should have been, whether you ever see it or not." His voice dropped. "But I'm asking for the chance to try to earn your respect through action, not words. To be your partner in the work you're doing, if you'll allow it." Serafina's mind raced. She thought of Philippe's offer, clean, uncomplicated, full of possibility. She thought of the girl she'd been 5 years ago walking out of that ballroom with tears threatening. She thought of the woman she'd become standing in a barn teaching fishermen's daughters to read. "I don't know if I can love you," she said honestly. "Too much hurt exists between us." "I know. But I'm willing to discover if we can build something new. Not a resurrection of what might have been, but something entirely different. Starting from where we are now, not where we were then. Hope flickered in Dominic's eyes. What would that look like? Friendship first, proving through sustained action, not grand gestures, but daily choices that you've genuinely changed. And I remain autonomous. My school, my work, my life remain mine. You don't rescue me, don't complete me, don't try to remake me into someone more acceptable to society. I would want nothing less. I don't want to rescue you, Serafina. You've already rescued yourself. I want to know you as you actually are, the educator, the artist, the woman who turns exile into purpose. I want to be your partner, your equal, not your savior. Serafina extended her hand. Then let us begin again, as strangers becoming acquaintances, becoming friends, and we'll see where honesty takes us. He took her hand carefully as if she might shatter. Thank you for the chance I don't deserve. None of us deserve the chances we're given, Dominic. We only deserve what we do with them. 1 week later, the Tremont Gallery had been transformed into something extraordinary. Philippe had worked with the gallery director to create a space that honored Serafina's vision. Deep blue fabric draped the walls, making her paintings luminous against the backdrop. Each of the 20 unseen portraits was lit to perfection. Fishwife with her weathered kindness, the midwife with her capable hands, the students bent over books with fierce concentration, Mrs. Porter teaching with gentle authority. And in the place of honor commanding attention, the moment one entered, hung the girl they called forgettable. Serafina's self-portrait from 5 years ago arrested the eye with its raw vulnerability. The girl in faded lavender stood half hidden by potted palms at a ball, her gray-blue eyes holding quiet sadness, but also unmistakable dignity. She'd painted her younger self with such tenderness, such compassion, that the girl became heartbreakingly beautiful, not despite her pain, but encompassing it. It's perfect, Philippe said, standing beside Serafina as final preparations were made. Everything is perfect. Serafina wore the same deep blue silk from the gathering. It had become something like armor, a reminder that she was enough exactly as she was. Her hair was arranged simply naturally, and her mother's pearls rested against her throat. What if they hate it? She whispered, old fears surfacing despite everything. Then they're fools, Philippe replied firmly, and their opinion will not matter. Your work speaks truth, Serafina. It insists that beauty and worth exist beyond society's narrow definitions. Some will resist that, but others will truly see, perhaps for the first time. Guests began arriving. The turnout was surprising. Critics from major newspapers, art collectors, educational reformers, and members of Boston society curious about the woman who'd spoken so unconventionally at her father's memorial. Dominic arrived early, positioning himself where he could observe without imposing. He'd kept his promise over the past week, calling on her twice, having careful conversations about education and philosophy, and the work of building something meaningful. No grand romantic gestures, just steady, consistent presence. The slow building of trust. He stood now before the girl they called forgettable, his expression unreadable. Henry Blackwood and his wife arrived greeting Serafina with genuine warmth. They were followed by others, some faces friendly, some merely curious, some openly skeptical. And then surprisingly, Cecilia Thornberry arrived, alone without her mother, wearing a simple dress that suggested she'd chosen substance over display. She approached Serafina during a quiet moment. I was cruel to you, she said without preamble. Not just 5 years ago, but every time we encountered each other before that. I'm sorry. Serafina studied the young woman who'd once laughed at her humiliation. What changed? Your speech at the memorial. Your paintings. Cecilia gestured at the portraits surrounding them. You had something I didn't purpose. Conviction. I've spent my whole life being ornamental decorative. You've spent yours being meaningful. She paused, vulnerability showing through her carefully maintained facade. I want to learn how to be meaningful too. It's not too late, Serafina said gently. It's never too late to choose substance over show. Do you truly think so? I know so. In fact, Rosemont Academy could use a teacher for literature and composition. Someone with your education, and if you're willing to learn your passion. The position doesn't pay well, but the work matters. Cecilia's eyes brightened with something that looked almost like hope. You would trust me with that, after everything. People can change, Cecilia. I've seen it happen. The question is whether you're willing to do the work. I am. I want to be. They talked for several more minutes, making tentative plans. As Cecilia walked away to examine the paintings more closely, Philippe appeared at Serafina's elbow. You're building your team, he observed with a smile, collecting allies. I'm offering second chances. It's what I would have wanted 5 years ago. That's what makes you remarkable. He paused, his expression growing more serious. I need to tell you something before the speeches begin. What is it? I'm withdrawing my personal interest, romantically, I mean. He held up a hand as she started to protest. But the professional partnership that offers stands stronger than ever. But the other, I've watched you this week, Serafina. The way you look at Thorne when you think no one's watching. The way you listen when he speaks. The way you're giving him the chance to prove himself. Philippe, you're falling in love with him, or perhaps you never fell out of love with who he could become. Either way, I won't stand in the way of that. His smile was genuine despite the sadness in his eyes. I told you I wanted your happiness above my own desires. I meant it. You're a better man than most. I'm a man who recognizes when he's lost before the battle truly begins. But Serafina, his voice turned serious. Make him earn it. Don't settle for guilt or grand gestures. Make him prove day after day that he's become the partner you deserve. I will. Good. He squeezed her hand briefly. Now shall we begin? You have a gallery full of people waiting to hear you explain why these invisible women deserve to be seen. Philippe moved to the center of the gallery and raised his hand for attention. Conversations quieted as Boston society turned toward the elegant Frenchman. Art reveals what society obscures. He began his accented English, lending weight to his words. Miss Serafina Whitmore has created portraits that force us to see worth we habitually overlook. These works are not merely technically accomplished, though they are. They are morally necessary. They insist that beauty and value exist beyond ballrooms and fashion beyond wealth and pedigree. His gaze found Serafina in the crowd. I present to you not just an artist, but a visionary, Miss Serafina Grace Whitmore. Applause rippled through the gallery as Serafina moved forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. I'm not accustomed to having Boston's attention directed at me with anything other than dismissal. She began, letting her eyes move across the assembled crowd, and I'm certainly not accustomed to being listened to rather than observed. A few uncomfortable shifts in the audience. Good, let them feel uncomfortable. These portraits are of women I've known in Rhode Island, women who taught me that worth isn't assigned by others, it's inherent. It exists whether or not anyone acknowledges it. She gestured to the paintings surrounding them. The fishwife who sold me oysters every Tuesday for 5 years. The midwife who brought half the village into the world. The students who learned to read despite society telling them education was wasted on fishermen's daughters. Each one invisible by Boston's standards. Each one extraordinary by any measure that actually matters. Her voice grew stronger. 5 years ago, I was told I was plain forgettable, designed by nature to fade into the wallpaper. Those words nearly destroyed me. She saw Dominic flinch, his hands gripping the program until it crumpled. But they also freed me to discover what I valued in myself, independent of anyone else's judgment. Freed me to build something real, rather than perform something acceptable. Serafina paused, letting the words settle. I hope these paintings make you uncomfortable. I hope they force you to question who you see and who you overlook. I hope they remind you that dismissing someone says more about your limited vision than their limited worth. The silence that followed was profound. Then someone began to clap, not Philippe this time, but Cecilia Thornberry standing alone with tears on her cheeks. Others joined the applause building until it filled the gallery. As guests dispersed to examine the paintings more closely, critics made notes with furrowed brows. One muttered to his colleague, revolutionary in subject and execution, this will cause quite a stir. Serafina moved through the crowd, accepting compliments with grace, answering questions about technique and subject matter. But her eyes kept finding Dominic standing before her self-portrait with an expression of such profound regret that it was almost painful to witness. Finally, during a quiet moment, she approached him. You've been staring at that painting for 20 minutes, she said softly. He didn't look away from the portrait. I'm trying to see what I missed. Trying to understand how I looked at this, he gestured at the girl in the painting, vulnerable and dignified, and saw nothing worth valuing. You see it now? Yes, but too late. 5 years too late. Serafina stood beside him, both of them studying the girl she'd been. Perhaps not too late. Perhaps exactly when you were ready to see clearly. He turned to her, then his gray eyes holding something raw and desperate. I love you. Not the girl you were, not even just the woman you've become, but all of it, the hurt I caused, the strength you found, the person you are right now. I know I don't deserve a chance. but I'm asking anyway. The confession hung between them, honest and terrifying. I don't know if I love you yet, Serafina said carefully. The hurt is still too fresh, the trust too fragile. I know, but I'm willing to find out, to see if what we're building can become something real, something built on respect and honesty rather than guilt and obligation. That's all I'm asking, the chance to prove myself worthy of your partnership. Before Serafina could respond, Philippe appeared with the gallery director, both looking pleased. Serafina, we've sold 6 paintings already, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts wants to discuss acquiring the girl they called Forgettable for their permanent collection. Serafina's breath caught. The museum. Her work in a permanent collection. Validation not from society's approval, but from genuine artistic merit. That's extraordinary. It's deserved, Philippe said warmly. Then with a knowing glance at Dominic, he added, I'll leave you two to continue your conversation. Congratulations, Serafina. You've shown Boston something it desperately needed to see. As Philippe walked away, Dominic took a deep breath. I should let you enjoy your triumph, he said. But before I go, I want you to know that I've made arrangements. A trust funded equally by both of us if you agree to expand Rosemont Academy's model across New England. 12 schools over the next 5 years. You would have complete control over curriculum, hiring everything. I would simply facilitate, provide resources without directing how they're used. Dominic, it's not a romantic gesture, it's not a bribe. It's simply recognition that what you've built deserves to expand, and I have resources that could help. Whether you choose me personally or not, I want to support this work. Because it matters. Because you matter. Serafina felt something shift in her chest, not the sudden, overwhelming rush of falling in love, but something quieter, more profound. The slow recognition that this man had truly changed, that his actions matched his words, that he was offering partnership, not rescue. We'll discuss it, she said finally. The trust, the expansion, all of it. But Dominic, no more grand gestures, no more public declarations. Just consistency. Show up, do the work, be the man you say you've become day after day after day. I can do that, I will do that. Then we'll see where it leads us. He smiled genuinely, hopefully, and it transformed his whole face. That's all I'm asking. The chance to walk beside you, not ahead of you or behind you, but beside you as an equal. Then walk with me now. Help me navigate this gallery full of critics and collectors. Be my partner in this moment, and we'll see about all the moments that follow. He offered his arm. She took it. And together they moved through the gallery, discussing art and education and the future they might build together, carefully, honestly, with full awareness of the past, but not trapped by it. The Whitmore Thorne Institute stood on Commonwealth Avenue, a beautiful 4-story building of red brick and limestone. A bronze plaque beside the entrance read, Founded 1870 by Serafina Whitmore Thorne and Dominic Ashford Thorne. Education is liberation. Inside the largest lecture hall, 200 students, half women, half men, all from working-class backgrounds, listened as Serafina delivered the opening address for the spring term. At 32, she'd grown into her authority the way some people grow into well-made clothes. Her hair showed the first threads of silver at the temples. Her face had lines that spoke of laughter and hard work. She wore a simple dark blue dress, practical and elegant, in her mother's pearls. Education, she told the assembled students, is not about making you acceptable to society. It's about giving you tools to transform society into something more, just more equitable, more humane. In the front row, 15-year-old Margaret Thorne listened with fierce attention, taking notes in a leather journal. Beside her, 12-year-old Theodore whispered something to his younger sister Alice, who hushed him with big sister authority. Dominic sat at the back of the hall, as he always did during Serafina's lectures. At 42, he'd aged well, silver threading through his dark hairlines, around his eyes from years of genuine smiling. He divided his time now between managing the trust that funded 23 schools across New England and teaching advanced mathematics to the Institute's most promising students. He watched his wife with the same mix of admiration and wonder he'd felt 5 years ago in the Tremont Gallery. She was magnificent. She'd always been magnificent. He'd just been too blind to see it. After the lecture, students filed out, many stopping to ask questions or share updates on their progress. Violet Harper, now 24 and director of the Providence Branch School, waited to discuss expansion into Connecticut. When the hall finally emptied, Serafina gathered her notes and found Dominic waiting. You added a new section about civic responsibility, he observed. The world needs citizens who think critically, not just workers who follow orders. Radical as ever, he smiled. I love that about you. Among other things, I hope. Among infinite things. He took her hand. Ready to go home. The children are expecting us for dinner, and Margaret wants to discuss her proposal for a summer teaching program. Like mother, like daughter. Terrifying and into another generation of Whitmore women who refuse to accept the world's limitations. They walked out together into the spring sunshine. The Institute's courtyard was filled with students engaged in animated discussion, their voices mixing with the sound of the city beyond the gates. Serafina paused, taking in the scene. Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you'd been kind that night instead of cruel? Dominic was quiet for a moment, considering. Every day, and I'm grateful I was cruel. She looked at him surprised. Not because I'm glad I hurt you, he clarified quickly, but because my cruelty forced you to discover your strength. If I'd been kind, you might have married me as the girl you were seeking approval, trying to be acceptable. You would have been miserable. I would have been unchanged. And none of this, he gestured at the institute, at the students, at the life they'd built, would exist. So you're saying your greatest gift to me was your worst behavior. I'm saying the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and that sometimes terrible things lead to extraordinary outcomes, not because the terrible things were good, but because extraordinary people refuse to be broken by them. Serafina leaned into him slightly. We did build something good, didn't we? We built something necessary, and we're not done building. That evening, the Thorne family gathered around the dinner table in their Beacon Hill townhouse, a home they'd purchased together, modified to include a library that rivaled some universities, filled with books and laughter, and the controlled chaos of three intelligent, opinionated children. Margaret presented her proposal for summer teaching with the same commanding presence her mother brought to lectures. Theodore challenged every assumption with the logical precision he'd inherited from his father. Alice, at 8, simply declared that when she grew up, she would open a school that taught both children and adults, because learning shouldn't stop just because you're old. Watching his family, Dominic felt the familiar wash of gratitude that still caught him by surprise. This life, messy, full, meaningful, was more than he'd ever deserved. But Serafina had given him the chance to earn it day by day, year by year, through consistency and honesty, and the slow, patient work of becoming better. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Serafina and Dominic stood together on the small balcony overlooking the garden. The city stretched out beyond gas lamps, flickering in the gathering darkness. Do you ever miss it? Dominic asked. The simplicity of Rhode Island before all this complexity. Sometimes, Serafina admitted. The quiet, the sea, the feeling that I was building something entirely mine without compromise. We could go back, if you wanted. Rosemont Manor is still there. We could spend summers teaching, winters in Boston. No, She turned to face him. What we have now is better. Not simpler, but better. Because it's ours together. Built on honesty and partnership and the understanding that we're stronger as allies than we ever could be alone. So, even with all the challenges, the funding fights, the political opposition, the people who think educating working-class women and men is dangerous, especially with those challenges, because we face them together. Because our children see what it means to fight for something that matters. Because we're building a legacy that outlasts our individual lives. Dominic pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I love you more every day. More than I knew it was possible to love someone. I know. I love you too. Not despite what happened between us, but including it. Because we chose each other knowing the worst of each other, and we chose to build something better. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in Boston, women who'd been told they were worthless were learning to read. Children of fishermen and factory workers were studying philosophy and science. Ideas that had been radical 5 years ago were slowly, painfully becoming mainstream. And in a small gallery in Providence, a new exhibition was opening, Scene Portraits of Dignity, by various artists inspired by Serafina Whitmore Thorne's work. The movement she'd started had grown beyond her, taking on life of its own. We did this, Serafina whispered. Not just you or me, but we together. We're still doing it, and we'll keep doing it until seeing the unseen becomes so normal, so expected, that it's no longer revolutionary. That might take generations. Then we'll teach our children to continue the work, and they'll teach theirs. That's what legacy means, not what we accomplish in our lifetime, but what we set in motion for all the lifetimes that follow. Serafina smiled. Then let's make sure we set the right things in motion. They went inside, back to the life they'd built from the ruins of cruelty and dismissal. A life of purpose and partnership. A life of meaning earned through daily choices, through consistency, through the slow, patient work of becoming who they were meant to be. And if sometimes Serafina still dreamed of that girl in faded lavender, standing alone on a terrace, and promising herself she wouldn't break, well, she could smile at that memory now. Because that girl had kept her promise. She hadn't broken. She'd transformed. And in transforming, she'd transformed the world around her, one student, one painting, one act of radical kindness at a time. That Serafina thought as she climbed into bed beside the man who'd learned to see her clearly was legacy enough for any lifetime, and more than enough to build upon for all the lifetimes that would follow.